Get your news in an easier, more efficient way this new year. The Newsworthy breaks down the day's top stories in less than 15 minutes and gives you some lighter conversation starters. It's quick, friendly, and informative. Search The Newsworthy wherever you're listening now and follow or subscribe to The Newsworthy today.
So I'm in the car with Dr. Lizzie Rogers, aka History Lizzie, curator of Bowood House and historian of 18th and 19th century history. And where are we going, Lizzie?
We're going to Steventon. We're taking a pilgrimage.
Of all the sites on the Jane Austen pilgrimage, of her home at Chawton Cottage and Chawton House, of her grave at Winchester, of even Bath, Steventon is a little out of the way, isn't it?
It's a little elusive, I think. I think because it is out of the way, you really need a car to get there.
There are many sites associated with Jane Austen. The two most visited are Bath, where she lived between 1801 and 1806, and Chawton Cottage, where she spent the last 8 years of her life and published all of her novels. Then there's Winchester, where she died and was buried. And less known, but still a contender, is Southampton, where she spent 2 years. Steventon, the village where she was born and where she spent the first 25 years of her life, is a site far off the beaten path.
We've been driving on these single-lane country roads, bordered by hedgerows, canopies of trees over our head. We left the motorway about 10 minutes ago, and we have not been on a main road since.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for Google Maps because I don't think we were finding this without it.
But Steventon is where she was born. It's where she spent the first 25 years of her life.
I know, which is so funny to me that it's not so much of a place where people can go, and there isn't a space for Jane Austen fans really to how to get there. It's such a contrast to Chawton and to Bath, and actually that's where she spent most of her life. It's crazy.
So off we go to Steventon. We drive through thin country roads couched in by thick hedges. Both Lizzie and I were warned that there wasn't much to see in Steventon. The rectory was demolished in 1831. The property is now privately owned. If you stand at the edges and look in, it appears like any other field in the rolling green English countryside. The grass has long grown thick over the foundations of the home. This is Finding Jane Austen, Episode 2, A Heroine is Born. I'm your host, Dr. Ann Furtick. Today, we're finding Jane Austen in this small Hampshire village to see if we can unearth her earliest years in the ruins of the home where she was born. Just a note before we proceed. There are a lot of Austens in this story. For this reason, I will be calling our heroine Jane throughout the series. While this might not be proper scholarly form, I want to make sure we all know which Austen we are talking about at any time. That said, I will refer to Jane's parents as Mr. and Mrs. Austen throughout the series to reduce confusion with their similarly named children. If you hear me refer to George and Cassandra Austen, assume I'm talking about their children. So, Mr. and Mrs., the parents. George and Cassandra, the children. Besides, there's something so wonderfully personal about knowing her as Jane. This was something Lizzie and I discussed as we walked the paved road from St. Nicholas Church, the site of the old rectory.
I think it's so personal to think of her as Jane. I think so too. People kept making reference to the fact that they can feel like they could sit down with her or one of her characters, so they were real. It was a very interesting statement for like a 19th century.
I agree, because I feel like a lot of us feel like that now. And a lot of us tend to see ourselves from a purely pop culture to tell you which Jane Austen heroine you are, or which novel you are, or which Jane Austen hero you're meant to be with, and things like that. But it is so interesting to map yourself onto those characters. I think, again, that's because she was such a great observer of human nature and personality.
And then we arrived at the gate. The site of the rectory is private property, so we couldn't enter. But we could stand at the edge of the road and stare in. You can sort of make out where, against the sloping landscape, the house where Jane Austen was born would have stood.
Yeah.
Intensely peaceful, very gentle sloping hills. There's still sheep out to this day.
It's actually further from the church than I thought it would be. In my head, it was across the road.
Same.
Where Steventon Manor now is. In my head, that's where it was, and I kind of liked that they had to walk up the lane.
Standing at the edge of this unperturbed green field, let's imagine something different. Let's go back 250 years to December 1775. The green grass disappears under a thick sheet of snow. Leaves blow away from the trees in a howling cold wind. The pavement crumbles away to reveal a hedged-in country lane. In summer, these roads are notoriously muddy, but the winter is harsh this year, and the ruts have frozen solid. Instead of an empty field, you look up to see Steventon Rectory, a 2-story brick house warm with candlelight amidst the foggy gloom. It sits close to the road, with a short, half-circle drive. There are 3 dormer windows in the garret space and 2 chimneys, both huffing with smoke in the winter sky. The windows have a wavy quality to them, like most glass produced in this time. Archaeology tells us that they had a slight bluish-green tint to them. Trees populate the land. There are no clean lawns here, as in the large, fashionable estates. Instead, it is partially wooded. Behind the rectory is land cleared for the kitchen garden. To the right, there is a barn, Mrs. Austen's pride and joy. 2 years before, she wrote that they were keeping turkeys, ducks, chickens, 6 cows, and a bull there. Walk towards the house, and you might hear it before you see it. There are at least 6 children living here, all under the age of 10. 5 boys and a girl named Cassandra. Walking in, you would enter through a passage that ran from the front of the house to the back, with the kitchens on one side and several larger rooms on the other. These rooms likely included common areas, such as the dining room and drawing room, as well as Mr. Austen's study, which overlooked the back garden. Mrs. Austen is heavily pregnant. She had been expecting to go into labor for a month. The 2 youngest Austen children, Frank and Cassandra, are barely out of babyhood. Little George is prone to seizures. There are 3 other sons here: Henry, Edward, and James. There may have been extra children in the household as well. Mr. Austen takes in students during the year for extra income, and it is difficult to say whether on that fateful December day, the students had left for the holidays yet. With so many children in the home and another on the way, Mr. Austen had possibly requested his sister Philadelphia to visit from London. It is likely that she brought her daughter Eliza with her. Eliza was born in India. And if Eliza was there, it is possible that Clorinda, the family's Indian maid, was also there. Clorinda was so integral to the Hancock family that she was even painted into their portrait. She had traveled to London with Philadelphia and Eliza, and she would later accompany them to the continent when Philadelphia decided that Eliza needed a French education. December 16th was a Saturday. Mr. Austen, as rector of 2 parishes, was likely preparing for his Sunday services when his wife went into labor with their 7th child. Jane indeed was born on December 16th, 1775. Mr. Austen writes to his family,
"You have doubtless been for some time in expectation of hearing from Hampshire, and perhaps wondered a little if we were in our age grown such bad reckoners. But so it was, for Cassie certainly expected to have been brought to bed a month ago. However, last night the time came, and without a great deal with warning, everything was soon happily over. We have now another girl, a present plaything for her sister Cassie, and a future companion. She is to be Jenny."
Well, Jenny may have been a family nickname. She was christened Jane the day after her birth. Her father performed the ceremony at home. Her father's report on her birth tells us quite a bit about the family and their expectations for their second daughter. She is to be a plaything, a companion, not necessarily a great English author. It would have been typical at the time for women to remain in bed for up to 6 weeks following a birth. This was called lying in. If Philadelphia were there, as many scholars speculate, she would have run the household in Mrs. Austen's place. One wonders how well Mrs. Austen took it. The dairy was her domain, as was the kitchen and directing the servants of the household. But Philadelphia could meet Mrs. Austen's independence with her own strong will. After all, at the age of 20, without any prospects, Philadelphia left England on her own to find a husband in India. For 14 weeks, little Jane remained in the rectory at Steventon, surrounded by her family. Then, in March 1776, she was handed off to a different family to be fostered and nursed. It was likely that she was sent to a woman named Elizabeth Littleworth, who had also fostered a few of her older siblings. The Littleworth family lived at Cheesedown Farm, which, let me just say, what a great name for a farm. There, Jane would remain for 12 to 18 months. This was fairly typical for middle-class families, and especially so for the Austens. Jane was the third child born in 3 years. Philadelphia would have returned to her fashionable life in London. With the budding spring, Mrs. Austen needed to ensure that planting would begin in the kitchen gardens. Jane's parents would visit her almost daily, however. In April, when the snow melted away and the leaves returned to the trees, she was baptized in the church of St. Nicholas, just up the lane from the rectory, where her father preached on Sundays. Thus passed Jane's first months of life, blissfully unaware of the problems soon about to arise. You see, Jane wouldn't realize it for many years, but her father was in debt. And soon, that debt would need to be collected. If you read Jane's books, or if you've watched the movies, you'll notice one major theme: money. Oh, sure, Jane's heroines fall in love with dashing heroes that all happen to be wealthy. But it's not just that Jane's heroines want to be rich. They want to be financially secure. Jane was born in a respectable family. Her father had a baronet as a cousin, and her mother's uncle was a well-established professor at Oxford. Philadelphia, Mr. Austen's sister, had married a well-to-do colonial official in India, and she had found an even wealthier godfather for her daughter. None other than the Governor General of India, a man named Warren Hastings. But Mr. Austen had been orphaned young. Abandoned by his stepmother after the death of his father, he was passed first to an uncle that mistreated him, and then to another uncle, who funded his studies. Despite his handsome looks, Mr. Austen had delayed marrying for many years, instead remaining celibate until a relative bought him the job at Steventon. Yes, bought him the job. You see, a rector was in charge of a parish in the Anglican Church. The rector's position was called a living, because he was paid from the tithes, or the annual contributions, of the parish to the church. But livings were not earned in this period. They were bought. People owned the rights over certain livings in towns and villages. And it was a relative of his that had purchased the living of Steventon, and a different relative that purchased the living of Dean. Both did this to provide Mr. Austen with a long-term income. And if this sounds completely bonkers, it was not uncommon in 18th century England. For example, officers in the military often had to purchase their officers' commissions. Despite this benefice, at the time of Jane's birth, Mr. Austen was in debt to 3 of his brother-in-laws, including his sister Philadelphia's husband, Tyso Saul Hancock. Hancock was working in India to support his wife's lavish lifestyle in London. Hancock may not have been pleased if he heard that Mrs. Austen was pregnant with her 7th child. A few years earlier, after the birth of Henry, and when Mrs. Austen was already pregnant with Cassandra, Hancock wrote to his wife,
"That my brother and sister Austen are well, I heartily rejoice, but I cannot say that the news of the violently rapid increase of their family gives me so much pleasure, especially when I consider the case of my godson must be provided for without the least hope his being able to assist himself."
The godson in question here was Jane's second brother, George. Here to explain is Dr. Juliet Wells, we met in the last episode.
Jane Austen had 6 brothers, and one of her elder brothers was George, and George is the one about whom we know the least. It seems clear from the historical record that when George was born, or when he was very, very young, his parents recognized that he had an inherited condition that resembled a condition that was known from Mrs. Austen's family, from her mother's family, and affected one of her brothers. And what we know for sure is that George was not brought up at home with his brothers and sisters. Mrs. Austen had the habit of placing her children, her very young children, with village families for their earliest years and then taking them back when they had gotten through the toddler years. But George remained with a village family, cared for in their household by them. What exactly George's conditions were, we are not sure. So it's guessing and speculation. Some guess that he may have been hard of hearing or deaf. Some guess that he may have had epilepsy. Some guess that he may have had intellectual disabilities, or perhaps some combination of these conditions or other conditions that just weren't written about explicitly enough for us to recognize them in terms of our medical categories today. George lived a very long life. He outlived Jane by decades. In fact, all of Jane's siblings outlived her considerably. So he was physically robust enough to live to his 70s.
By the time Jane was born, the family was coming to terms with the fact that George would likely need care and support his entire life. George's godfather was his Uncle Hancock, and Uncle Hancock had a very good point. Mr. Austen could barely afford the children he had, and with George's future at stake, Uncle Hancock thought that perhaps separate bedrooms for Mr. and Mrs. Austen were in order. Fortunately for fans around the world, Mr. and Mrs. Austen would not take separate bedrooms. And, thanks to that, Jane came into the world. In fact, they would go on to have another son after Jane, little Charles, the baby of the family. And Jane would grow up in a family intellectually, socially, and spiritually active, but financially struggling. But as we know, when Jane was born, her father was in debt to Uncle Hancock. Out of politeness, Hancock likely did not push the matter. And there was also another reason Uncle Hancock did not criticize the birth of yet another Austen child. Because unbeknownst to the Austens, or to Philadelphia Hancock, by the time little Jane was born, the family benefactor Tyso Saul Hancock was already dead. Hancock had died in November 1775 in Calcutta, 1 month before Jane was born. It took several months, however, for the news of Hancock's death to reach London from India. It appears that her parents were already in London visiting Philadelphia when the news came. Philadelphia plummeted into grief. Grief, of course, could not delay the more pertinent questions of how Philadelphia was going to support herself and her daughter. Sure, her husband left her £600 a year, 3 times as much as her brother Mr. Austen made from 2 livings and a school. But the Hancocks had a higher standard of living than the Austens. Both Hancock and Philadelphia had wanted only the best for Eliza. She had a harpsichord and a pony. Her father had sent lavish gifts while he worked in India. Spices and muslins and diamonds and pearls. She learned to dance, speak French, and sing. She and her mother lived in fashionable homes in London, while her father worked abroad. But now, with Hancock's death, all of her parents' dreams for her might fizzle away. Hancock, too, as it turned out, was deep in debt. The lavish spending had come at a cost. He was supporting the Austen family and also his own siblings. There were concerns that Hancock's estate would not leave enough to go around. Philadelphia also worried about the fortunes of Clorinda, the family's Indian servant. Over the next few years, Philadelphia would pay for up to 6 surgeries to treat an issue with Clorinda's hand, and by 1780, she was begging Warren Hastings for more support to aid Clorinda. It was likely decided at this time that Mr. Austen needed to start paying back his debt. Perhaps he offered it as solace to his grieving sister. Perhaps Philadelphia knew that she would have to take a more active role in ensuring that Eliza could marry well. Either way, this would have been a considerable burden to Mr. Austen. He had just had his 7th child. Even with 2 livings and the income from teaching, he was still barely making ends meet. Philadelphia would not have to worry long. A gift from dear family friend Warren Hastings would help keep her and her daughter afloat. Hastings increased Eliza's trust from £5,000 to £10,000. Eliza was certainly lucky to have such a generous godfather. So much so that people speculate to this day if Hastings was her biological father. But that is perhaps the subject of a different podcast. With the enlarged gift from Hastings, it appears that Philadelphia's need for her brother to repay her faded away, if only temporarily. She, Eliza, and Clorinda would leave London in 1777 for Germany to get Eliza the European education her late father had wanted for her. But while their fortunes had improved, there was the care of little George to consider. Who would take care of George long term without his godfather's support? Little George may not have been living with his parents at this time. While there are mentions of him at Steventon, he was likely already fostered out to a local family who could meet his needs around the clock. While sending away a disabled relative seems cruel by modern standards, in the 18th century, it was the kinder option.
I think George had the best kind of treatment that was available, and treatment understood not in a medical sense. Who knows what medical treatments were applied to George, and probably none that we would recognize today as having medical efficacy. But in terms of being cared for in a home, being looked after, seeing his family members, versus placed in whatever Regency version of an asylum there would have been.
The options for people with disabilities at this time were slim. Many were sent to institutions like Bedlam Hospital, where they might face neglect, physical abuse, and inhumane conditions. Alternatively, adults with disabilities who could not support themselves were often sent to workhouses. So sending him to be cared for by someone with the time to supervise him was the kind option. Mr. and Mrs. Austen would pay to support him their entire lives. After the death of Mr. Austen, George's brothers would also contribute to George's care. Sometime in George's early youth, probably around the age of 13, he was sent 10 miles away to live with the Cullum family in the village of Monk Sherborne. His uncle Thomas, who had a similar condition, also had lived with this family for many years. Because we don't know exactly when George was sent away, we cannot say for certain. However, if he was indeed sent away at the age of 13, as some scholars speculate, then it may have been right around the time that Mrs. Austen realized she was pregnant with her 8th and final child. Jane would have been around the age of 3. She would have been back living with the family from her nurse for about a year or 2 at this point. She could walk and talk. We don't know what she thought of George or of this time in her life. Nothing survives to tell us. However, many years later, in 1808, Jane would make a passing reference to using sign language to communicate. The idea that Jane knew sign language suggests that George may have been deaf. It also provides some circumstantial evidence that Jane knew her brother George and was close enough to him to communicate fluently. But how much evidence is there really for this claim? So far, I have not found any scholars who have done an in-depth study of this claim. So, what are we to do in this situation? Throw up our hands and give up? Given to base speculation? No, my dear listeners. I would like to invite you to help me solve this mystery. Let's dive into a segment I call Austen History Mysteries. In this segment, we take the myths, rumors, and obscurities of Jane's life, and we consider the evidence. Case number 1. Did Jane Austen know sign language? Exhibit A. The letter. The argument that Jane knew sign language was based off a letter written in December 1808, in which Jane writes about a gentleman she met named Mr. Fitzhugh.
Poor man is so totally deaf that they say he could not hear a cannon were it fired close to him. Having no cannon at hand to make the experiment, I took it for granted and talked to him a little with my fingers, which was funny enough. I recommended him to read Corinna.
Jane refers to talking with her fingers, meaning that she was using some signs to communicate with Mr. Fitzhugh. What I find most interesting about this is her recommendation for a book, Corinna. It suggests that the conversation surpassed basic signs and that they actually had a conversation of some sort. But my next question was, what was British Sign Language like in this period? American Sign Language didn't see its formation until the early 1800s. French Sign Language was in its infancy at this point. Was British Sign Language a standardized, widespread vernacular at this time? Was it plausible that Jane knew a form of sign language that was communicable to both her brother and a perfect stranger? Which brings us to Exhibit B, the history of sign language in Britain. Turns out, there was actually quite a bit of movement in both the 17th and 18th centuries towards a standardized sign language. In fact, we have multiple texts from between 1680 and 1720 that show a manual alphabet. That means letters you can form with your hands that are remarkably similar to modern British Sign Language. So the alphabets people were signing with in that period are similar to the ones that people still use today in Britain, signifying that there was an established system in place. Deaf schools were being established in London by the 1790s, unfortunately just a little too late for George Austen. So yes, British Sign Language not only existed at this point, but it was already codified as a language for deaf communities in Britain. But that just leaves one more question. Exhibit C. Was George Austen deaf? Scholars often rely on Jane's assertion that she was talking with her fingers as proof that George was deaf. Other than that, we don't really have much evidence for it. That doesn't mean he wasn't deaf. It just means that the archive is silent on the matter. The premise of this argument also relies on George's difficulty of hearing. And this is where it gets tricky. Because other than the fact that he had seizures, we know very little about his condition. Mr. Austen once made the cryptic remark that,
"We have this comfort. He cannot be a bad or wicked child."
and Mrs. Austen once reported,
My poor little George is come to see me today. He seems pretty well, though he had a fit lately. It was near 12 months since he had one before, so I was in hopes they had left him, but must not flatter myself so now.
George's condition was often compared to two other relatives, his Uncle Thomas on his mother's side, and, many years later, Eliza's son, Hastings. Hastings also suffered from what at the time were called fits, and Eliza worried that his condition was similar to George's. There are references to developmental delays for Hastings. He struggled to walk and talk, which suggests that George may have had similar delays. If George had speech delays, he might have still been taught signs as a way to communicate with his family and foster parents, even if he wasn't deaf. But that is just informed speculation. Conclusion. It is possible that Jane could have known an early form of British Sign Language, but it is circumstantial that her brother was actually deaf. More work needs to be done in this area before we can make a definitive claim. But I personally find Jane's letter interesting. It does imply that her conversation with Mr. Fitzhugh was more than just a simple exchange of pleasantries, regardless of whether or not they were using British Sign Language. If Jane did know sign language, however, it suggests that the Austen family still found it important to educate George, and that they loved him deeply. The Austens highly valued education, and they wrote letters to each other constantly. It may be a heartening sign that George was not forgotten. So for now, let's file this one under maybe. Let us return now to our narrative. By 1779, George had left the household, and baby Charles had joined it. James, the eldest son, was now 14, and he too left the rectory to begin his studies at Oxford. And Jane, at 4 years old, was beginning to become more aware of the world around her. What was it like to grow up in the late 18th century? At this point in time, England is still firmly in what was called the Georgian period. We're not quite at the Regency yet. George III is still the king, The American Revolution has just reached its midpoint. Skirts are still wide, hair is still tall. Of course, the toddler Jane, much of that is largely meaningless. Jane is growing up at a time of great change. At this point in European history, attitudes around childhood were changing. The 18th century saw a swift break in tradition with previous generations of child rearing. Before, children had been seen as born with sin and thus needing to be corrected to become good, moral adults. Parents were expected to be strict, with liberal use of corporal punishment. But two philosophers changed the way that parents viewed childhood. The first was John Locke in 1693, and then Jean-Jacques Rousseau decades later in the 1760s. These philosophers introduced the idea that children were born innocent, or blank slates, and thus needed guidance and education from their parents, not punishment and correction. And interestingly enough, one of the first places that we start to see the shift is in children's clothing. And they began right around the time when Jane was a child. So we asked an expert about what a young Jane might be wearing at this time.
For a lot of human history, Western human history, children wore kind of smaller versions of adult clothing. My name is Hilary Davidson. I'm an associate professor at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. What's interesting about the late 18th century in terms of children's clothing is that actually a lot of the changes that would come about in the 1790s were first being used in children's dress throughout 1770s, 80s, etc. And Jane Austen, who was born in 1775, would have been partaking of some of these. So by that I mean ever so slightly more high-waisted dresses, just things that are a little bit looser, a little bit more simply cut, and certainly things that could have used cotton where it would have been afforded. At this point, though, young girls are still put into stays from the time that they're quite small. They're not necessarily boned, the stiffening increases as you get older, but actually they're quite a practical way to keep a child warm and attach petticoats and things like that. So Jane Austen would have probably been wearing sort of simpler versions of the adult styles popular at the time. And a lot of this simplification of children's clothing was influenced by people like Rousseau, whose book Emile, published in the 1760s, really advocated for simpler, easier to wear clothing for children so that they could kind of grow up in a state of naturalness. So we kind of have that sort of idea of the unmediated human body coming through philosophically for children first and then expanding further into adult dress.
In Jane's earliest years, she was likely tagging along after her mother and older sister. Jane was several years away from a formal education, but that doesn't mean she wasn't being taught within the household. Young girls would begin by following their mothers as they completed their social and household duties. Mrs. Austen, as the wife of a rector, had obligations to those in the parishes her husband served. We don't know when Jane learned to read and write, but the Austens were a highly literate family. Mrs. Austen composed poetry, and Mr. Austen's library would eventually grow to include over 500 books. And it would soon become a family tradition for the children to put on a play at Christmas time. So Jane, at her earliest ages, was surrounded by stories and language and literature. She wore loose clothing that allowed her to trail after her brothers and older sister. She listened as her older brother James began scribbling his own poetry. She also likely listened as her family read popular novels together as a group. Jane had a deep childhood friendship too with the children in the surrounding villages. She grew close to Betsy Littleworth, the young daughter of her wet nurse. She also likely formed her lifelong attachment to her sister at this point in her life. Cassandra was 2 years older than Jane. She was said to be a talkative child, with a more even temper than Jane. Just as Mr. Austen predicted, Jane quickly became Cassandra's shadow. From the earliest days, whatever Cassandra did, Jane had to do as well. Here is a story given to us by Anna Austen Lefroy, one of Jane's nieces who lived with her grandparents and aunts during her childhood. She describes,
They must, however, have been separated sometimes, as Cassandra in her childhood was a good deal with Dr. and Mrs. Cooper at Bath. She once described to me her return to Steventon one fine summer evening. The Coopers had sent or conveyed her a good part of the journey. But my grandfather had to go, I think, as far as Andover to meet her. He might have conveyed himself by coach, but he brought his daughter home in a hack chaise. And almost home they were when they met Jane and Charles, the two little ones of the family, who had got as far as New Down to meet the chaise and have the pleasure of riding home in it. But who first spied the chaise, tradition does not say. Whether such happiness were the lawful property of Jane or Charles will never be exactly understood.
Jane was likely around 6 or 7 years old when this incident took place. She rallied up her younger brother, and together they walked several miles alone along the muddy Hampshire lanes. This story tells us two things about a very young Jane Austen. One, that she was determined, independent, and active in getting what she wanted. If that meant traipsing several miles through the infamously muddy lanes of Hampshire without adult supervision, then so be it. And two, she must have been a precocious little ringleader to get baby Charles in the gig as well. Thinking of these early years, it is easy to imagine a peaceful, archetypically English scene. The truth is, we don't know much about her early childhood. Oh sure, we can track the comings and goings of her parents. We can fill in the gaps with what we know of young children at this time. But this period is largely shadowy. There are so many questions I have of this period of Jane's life. What was her education like at home? Was little Jane an entertainer? Or did she fade into the background of a large and rambunctious family? When did her capacity for imagination first sharpen into view? What we do know is that the 6 or 7-year-old Jane who braved the muddy country lanes to get that first glimpse of her returning sister, well, that little Jane was on the cusp of her first big adventure. For as small as she was, just a year later, Jane would leave Steventon for her education. Girl of not quite 8 years would have been considered a bit too young to go to school in these days. But Jane insisted on it, because if Cassandra was going away to school, then you better believe that Jane was going with her. School would mark the first and last time Jane lived away from her family. And it was there that Jane Austen almost died. Thanks for listening to Finding Jane Austen. If you liked today's episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It helps us spread the love of Austen. Finding Jane Austen is a joint production of Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media. The series is researched and written by me, Dr. Anne Fertig. My executive producers are Jeanette Patrick and Jim Imbusky. Our thanks to our scholars, Lizzie Rogers, Juliet Wells, and Hilary Davidson, for their contributions to this episode, and to our voice actors, Grace Mallon and Adam Smith. Subscribe to Finding Jane Austen on your favorite podcast app. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.